Hey guys, Ghazzy TV here with another Path of Exile 2 video, and in this one, let's talk about defenses. That is the current plan that we're going to be doing, and this is actually perfect to get a trade here, because this is one of the things we can talk about. This here is a Chaos Resistance Life Mana armor piece here with a lot of armor. There's even attributes here, an open suffix. I sold that for 5x. Sure. By the way, when you're trading, make sure that you always barter. If you can get things cheaper, you should try to do so. Doesn't matter if it's me selling it or someone else. You actually always should try to barter. It helps a lot. So the defensive stuff that I'll be talking about in this video is going to be very limited to a very specific corner of the game. This is because I have basically most of my experience almost exclusively in playing the Witch. I have very little information outside of the Witch. And I'm going to talk about different styles of defenses that I've seen and that I've played with myself. Kind of what to expect of how to gear with them, as well as what to expect in terms of budget with the current very crazy market. So that said, we're going to dive into it, and we're going to talk about lower budget or campaign-wise first when you go through the acts of 1 through 3, and then the cruel difficulties as well. In basically every single build, you'll be looking at playing with life. Now, the skill tree in Path of Exile 2, unlike PoE 1, does not have many life nodes at all. There's a couple of them. They're not really super strong or anything, but they do exist. Now, are they important to pick up? A bit hard to tell, because if I do a life search and I look for the life modifiers, there's a couple of them that exist. For example, up here, you have a node that gets you 3% max life, mana, and energy shield. There's a node called Unbending, which is down here somewhere. No, it's a block node. Here it is. Unbending, 3% maximum life. So there's a couple of these small ones. The Infernalist Ascendancy have a couple of these as well. So they're pretty strong in general. But most of the cases, or the most part, as you progress through the campaign, as well as early stage of mapping, your defenses are almost exclusively going to come from your gearing. There are some defensive modes on the tree. Mostly this is about energy shield to ramp up that, which is what the higher end budgets are. We'll talk about that in a bit. So when you go through the campaign, essentially what you want to do is two major things, or three rather. You want to make sure that your weapon for whatever build you're playing is up to date. For minions specifically, that would be using weapons that gets plus level of minion skills. This exists on amulets as well as your helmet. And for caster builds, you're looking for levels of spells, but also other types of damage sources for on your weapon. And that's like a common theme on the offensive scaling, whereas the rest of your gear should almost exclusively be there to cover two very major things. One is obviously just the actual life. You can go through the campaign and have a couple of good life items, and it will carry you through the entire campaign. But if you don't have those, you're going to have a very miserable experience and die a lot. The other part is resistances. Now, in PoE 1, it's kind of important to get to the point where you're capping your resistances, which is 75%. Ignore the fact that I have negative lightning rust. This is very specific to the build that I'm playing. But you want to cap your resistances kind of early on if you can. But in most cases in PoE 2, this is not something you'll really achieve in an effective manner till you reach end of campaign, even early stage mapping. On launch, I didn't have my resistances capped till I was in mid-tier maps, like 5 or tier 6, 7 maps. That's when I got my rest capped, and the chaos rest was not capped at that point. That didn't come till later. Now, a while later, we're in a position where the gear that is not super high end or super high rolls are kind of cheap to get your hands on. You drop exalted orbs quite often as they change that. So now you can buy leveling items for minions, for example. That actually comes in the form of Enfolding Dawn, for example, which doesn't give you life, but it does give you resistances. And utilizing the charms, the runes rather, is also very important to do if you have access to the Artificer's Orb to help navigate and guide your way through the resistance jungle to cap those without losing that life count. So, for example, the red ones I have here actually gives me, is called a Soul Core of Takati that gives chaos resistance. I would completely ignore chaos rest in the early stages because it is more expensive to buy those items. They are a bit rare to find. Just focus on capping your elemental rest and get life in your pieces. So what then happens is when you get to the low budget or early mapping stage, if you will, of the game, now you're in a position where you might be doing the build yourself or following a build guide. And when you're following a build guide, it's very important that you make sure that that guide is designed to be for lower budget or initial endgame content. For example, the build I'm playing right now is negative lightning resistance, utilizing very, very specific unique items to make this work. This is not something I would recommend playing on a low budget. I also wouldn't recommend trying to do energy shield based focused builds because of how expensive those items are, and it can be very daunting to try to make that work in a comfortable way without you dying all the time. So when it comes to minion builds, we have two very specific builds I'll mention in this video. One is Creparian's Life Stacking Summoner, and I also have a Titan Warrior Summoner, which is also a life stacking approach. And then the build that I have for the Infernalist, I believe we'll have a link of that in the descriptions below, is a Mind Over Matter approach. So how do you then go through deciding how to design your defenses? The most common way of defenses is just go life. That's it. You have life, cap your resistances, you're done. Other ways of scaling defenses is using what's called MOM, or Mind Over Matter. This makes it so that all your damage that you take is that is not hitting your energy shield. That is going to your life pool is now redirected to your mana pool instead. All your damage. It also lowers your mana recovery. And this is commonly combined together with Eldritch Battery that converts all of your energy shield to mana. What this does is essentially making all sources of increased mana on gear as well as on the tree. There's a bunch of these nodes, for example, this one right here, Mana Blessing, gets you plus flat mana. There's a bunch of these nodes around that you can get to increase your mana regen if you decide to do a style like that, which my low budget Infernalist minion build is actually doing. However, all of these things comes down to two very specific parts of layered defenses. One is recoup. And what is recoup, you might ask? We can look at a recoup node right here. What recoup is doing is that it takes a percent of the damage that you have received and then recovers or regenerates this over the course of 8 seconds. You can hover over the item or modifier that has this and hold down Alt and then move your cursor to the recoup and it will tell you this. And so 8% is you can have 100%, if you will, with some builds of the damage you take is then going to be regenerated to the point where you get all of the damage you took back again over the course of 8 seconds. But that is an 8-second window. So how do we then tackle this specific issue? Right now, in the current state of the game, at least for the Witch Ascendancy or the Infernalist that I've been playing, again, a very limited corner here on the market. I don't have experience enough with the other classes to tell you. But for the Witch, most commonly, we're looking at actually going for block. And the block has a couple of very specific modifiers on the tree. We're going to go for the Aegis tree of the side of things, where we pick up Wide Barrier. Gives you increased chance of block. The small nodes does this as well. Many builds in the endgame actually uses jewels to increase block chance as well. There's another node here on the bottom side or the left side of the tree that is called defensive reflexes. It's very common that most of the builds now, for at least from the Infernalist, is actually oiling or using the anointment on their amulets to get flashy deflections because it's a cheap one. Greed Guild Greed comes from the Delirium content to get even more defenses from block chance. There's a couple more here on the left-hand side. There's, for example, the Unstoppable Barrier. If you're playing a warrior build, for example, is using this as well, and Vigilance. So there's a lot of these things, and block is extremely valuable in the current state of the game. It caps at 75%, and that's kind of like the baseline stuff that you'll be looking at for most initial endgame builds, such as minion builds or MOM or life stacking. It doesn't really matter. All of them will kind of lean into going with whatever life they're doing or mana if they're doing the MOM Eldritch Battery, and they want to stack up block as much as possible. So how will you then be able to increase your survivability if you're going through the campaign, you start mapping? Obviously, you're going to look at your block chance. You're going to look at your resistances. Are they capped? If they're not, then you know what to look out for. Attribute-wise, so you don't have to think about attributes. It is the most common question I see from people in the early stage of the game. Oh, what stats are you stacking? You can't stack stats. It is impossible. I'm at the point right now at level 91 where I can say, I can grab some extra strength for some extra life. You have to take whatever stat you need to be able to equip your gear and use the gems that you want to use. You have no choice. You have to do that with your attributes. So make sure that's covered. And then once that is covered, then you can go out of your way. So if you're doing Mind of a Matter or Eldritch Battery, then you can pick up Intelligence because it gives you mana. Or if you do Life version, well, then you pick up some Strength, for example. So that's the kind of way you need to think about the attributes in general. And then anything above or in the next step of progression, if you go from this low budget or the initial end game stage of the game, you want to look at what can you do next. If you're inexperienced with the game, and that might be the reason you're clicking onto this video to learn about these things, my recommendation, especially for PoE2, is to follow a build guide. Like it's going to be much easier for you. And as you get more experience and learn the ropes of the game, then you can deviate and do your own things. But to have a better experience with the game, I would wholeheartedly recommend following a guide. So higher budget versions or the higher endgame content have a kind of a variety of different approaches. For example, to reference again, Crypt's Lifestack in Infernalist minion build, or my MOM version of minion build, can do tier 14, tier 15, to some degree tier 16 maps. But both of those builds in that specific, very low budget, very new player friendly, very gear equipment finding friendly approach to the game, they do suffer from the problem of getting one shot from very specific content in the higher end game. To avoid this, you have to go to a bit of more investment, and in some cases there's a roof or a ceiling that you hit, and now you have to look at other types of defenses to get past that stage. And right now, in the current state of the game at the time of this recording, that is, for the Infernalist at least, block and energy shield. And the way that is done is utilizing the Grim Feast aura. What this does is that anytime enemies dies, there's a 50% chance that they drop a remnant or a Grim Feast shard or energy shield remnant. Anytime a reviving minion, like skeletons, for example, or specters later, but the doggy and skeletons, when they die, there's a 50% chance that they will spawn this energy shield remnant, which in my case, in this character, is generating 684 energy shield. This is like a little blue-white fragment on the ground. You'll have to run over it and you'll get that energy shield. But most important, what Grim Feast allows you to do is overflow energy shield. Overflow is a new mechanic in PoE2 that allows you to double the amount it overflows. So right now I'm sitting on 5,626 energy shield, but I can get twice that from overflowing. This is extremely effective when you're clearing. However, Grim Feast and this is about energy shield focused approach. Energy shield gear, due to the nature of how popular and extremely tanky this allows you to become, gear equipment in general on the trade is also extremely expensive as a result of this. And right now the market is very wild. I don't know what's causing it or why it is the way it is. I'll be honest, it is nuts. So my recommendation in general is to follow or stick to a new player or beginner friendly new initial end game low budget kind of build guide. Stick to that, generate your or accumulate your wealth, and go from there to then upgrade your character into this energy shield style. And that's kind of going to give you a much smoother experience moving forward as you progress in the early stages of Path of Exile 2. Obviously, this might change in a week. This might change in 2 weeks from now as they're constantly making updates to the game. But as of the time of this recording, that is how you need to think about it. So a TLDR recap is essentially, as you progress through the campaign, make sure you don't neglect having life modifiers on gear. You might have an item that gives you extra damage to your gloves on attacks, for example. But if that item does not have a life modifier and the item you're replacing has like 30, 40 HP, you shouldn't replace that unless you know what you're doing. The life modifiers is so valuable as you progress. They're also extremely valuable as you progress in the early stage of the game, or like I said before, mana modifiers if you're doing the mind over matter strategy. So don't neglect those things. But most importantly, as you get to the stage where like you're done with the campaign, you're doing maps in a TLDR fashion, make sure that your elemental resistances are capped. And once they are capped and you have life in your gear, Chaos Rush is not a bad thing to do. And that's basically the gist of the generic basic approach of surviving in Path of Exile 2 right now. Besides the old comment, use your dodge roll, don't get hit. And my recommendation is, at least in the current meta, to look at block chance and get that. Gear-wise, I do want to point out that you can use shields with a modifier that has increased chance to block chance, which allows you to scale even further from the increased block chance modifiers that you get from the skill tree, for example. This is also extremely valuable. And items such as this cost very little currency. So if I look at this shield, for example, and say, well, I'm going to want to have a modifier with this. Let's say I want to have more life than that. Let's say I want to have 100 HP. And you want to have a little bit of cold rest on top of that. If I search for this, you'll see these items cost 1 Exalted. And as you drop quite a lot of Exalted orbs nowadays in the current state, this is not like a very hard thing to get a hold of. This shield right here even has 23 Chaos Rest, 30 Lightning. This is triple rest shield with like a little bit of life, but you get a ton of block. It's one Exalted, and an item like this can literally save or make or break your entire early game progression feeling, as you will then be significantly tankier and more sustainable in your current character's own personal defenses moving forward in the early stage of mapping for one Exalted. So I would recommend utilizing the trade and thinking about those things. And again, I would recommend following a build guide to make sure that you know exactly how you're doing. So I want to do a little bit of continue this little yapping rant that I'm on right now and talk about the pros and cons of certain things or the aspect of it. Essentially, we have life-based version that we talked about. We talked about Eldritch Battery Mind Over Matter, which is also called a MOM build. There's also another thing called CI, which is referring to a keystone called Chaos Inoculation over here, which makes your life 1, but you are literally completely immune to chaos damage. Currently, I don't see many uses of this, at least not from the witch uses of the builds that I have been having experience with. Again, very limited experience with different varieties of other builds. I've mostly been focusing on minions, and therefore that's what this video is going to be catering to, if you will. But this is one way of regenerating defenses. However, what you will do with the Chaos Inoculation is either run this with the whole idea of the Mind Over Matter, where all the damage goes to your mana pool, or you run it in the combination of running pure energy shield, which is kind of like the thematic meta that people are doing right now, because you can basically make your character unkillable in tier 16 maps, which is crazy cool, but it also costs you an arm and a leg and then some, and that's just beyond insane, and most people will not be able to accumulate that amount of wealth to pull that off. So that said, I just want to mention these kind of different approaches that you can do, and the value of recouping, like I mentioned, due to it being over 8 seconds, is not something you can entirely rely on, which is why the current state is, pushing or incentivizing people to mitigate damage fully, either by dodging enemies through evasion, or in the witch's case, we're looking at block-oriented stats to stay alive. Anyways, I just wanted to have a little video about this. I'm getting a lot of questions on stream about surviving, what they should think about. So I hope this video is of use for at least some of you guys out there. And for those of you who already know all of this and just sick and tired of hearing my voice ranting on and yapping about this, do me a favor. In the comments down below, leave your best tip for the new players coming into Path of Exile 2, how they can get help or learn to survive in the progression of campaign and early stage of mapping. And maybe we can help a few people out there. And on your way out, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Till then, stay safe, keep rocking.